Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Race, Nation, and Genocide, Terror in the 20th Century, a professional development webinar presented by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me just introduce you to the Center. We're an Institute for Advanced Study located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our main program is a fellowship program that brings scholars to the Center for an academic year to do research and writing in subjects like history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We offer a lot of resources and programs for teachers of American history and literature. You discovered one of our programs, these webinars, but if you go to americainclass.org, you'll land on this page, and from this page you will have access to all of the resources we provide for teaching in American history and literature. After this seminar, please go back to the Nation, Race, and Genocide website. There you'll find a recording of this program and our PowerPoint. Feel free to take any of the material from the PowerPoint you'd like to use in your class. That's what it's there for. You will also find an evaluation. Please fill that out and send it to us. We pay attention to those, and we try to improve our programs based upon what you tell us. Once we've received your evaluation, we will send you a letter of documentation, which you'll be able to present to your local certifying authority to receive whatever recertification credit your participation in this seminar warrants. Now, let me tell you how you can participate. Our leader tonight, Jonathan Reynolds, will be making comments and stopping to ask questions from time to time. We hope you'll respond to those questions, and you can do that by putting your cursor in that box that I have bracketed there in green. It's at the lower right-hand side of your screen. Type your message, hit that send button to the right, and your message will appear in the larger box above. I'll be following the chat all night and bringing it into the conversation at appropriate times. Now, don't wait for us to pose a question. Ask questions of your own, or feel free to make comments. Give us feedback on how you teach this material. If you see something that's particularly valuable for a class, let us know. Let us know how you'd use it. And if you see potential projects or assignments in the material, share those with us as well. The more you participate, the better the webinar. So let's get underway. We had some interesting comments in the forum. People set some goals for our seminar tonight, and I think we'll be able to reach all of them. One teacher wrote, "I hope to hear how other teachers frame questions about genocide." Well, that's something that we'll be talking about tonight. "I hope to obtain a better understanding of the historical perspective of genocide," and that's definitely a topic we'll be looking at. Another teacher wrote, "Most students don't even realize that there are genocides outside of the Holocaust," and we'll be exploring genocides beyond the Holocaust this evening. So our seminar tonight should be able to address all the concerns that the teachers raised in the forum. To lead us through these concerns, we're very pleased to have with us Jonathan Reynolds, who is a professor of history at Northern Kentucky University. Jonathan teaches African and last year he received the Northern Kentucky University Milburn Outstanding Professor Award, and I think you'll understand why he won that award as we move through our seminar this evening. So, Jonathan, it's all yours. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard, and welcome participants to our fabulous Valentine's Day edition of Race, Nation, and Genocide. Wow, what a heavy topic. I have to say that as a historian, I spend a lot of time talking about good stuff that happens in history as well as bad stuff, but you know, sometimes the bad stuff is what you got to talk about, and this is certainly one of those cases that sort of highlights some of the worst things that human beings have to offer. Let's see here. There we go. All right. So what are the goals for this webinar at a very broad level? Responding to one of the first questions that someone posted before the seminar, the goal is to gain an understanding of the concept of genocide and its place in history. Where does the concept of genocide even come from? And how can we apply that to history out in the 20th century and outside of the 20th century? The big argument I'm going to be making here is that in the 20th century, to understand genocide and understand why the 20th century is in some ways the century of genocide, is to highlight two key ideas. And those are the ideas of race and nation in how they have influenced genocide in recent world history. Um, in a trickier way, one of the things I'm also going to bring up here is the moral complexity of 20th century genocides. And I don't mean that, ooh, maybe that genocide wasn't so bad. Genocides are all bad, as are pogroms and mass murders. Um, but one of the things that makes genocide hard to prevent, hard to stop, is that genocides are not always cut and dried in terms of who the aggressors are, or whether or not countries have the right to police conflicts within their borders. So that's one of the things we'll get at. But you'll see that some genocides are less complex than others. And finally, we're going to try and provide you with the insights and tools necessary to better present the subject of genocide to your students. And the caveat here, by the way, is, oh, wow, there's a lot of information here. Don't try and remember everything. One reason why this webinar will be available for you to mine for information is so you don't have to try and remember all the details and such. And indeed, we may very well not get all the way through. Richard, actually, there's a new device, the National Humanities Center Shockomatic. If I'm going too slow, he's going to start delivering me increasingly powerful electrical shocks over the course of this to get me moving along.
I've got the switch right here too, Jonathan, so watch out.
There you go. Feel free to type in haha or something like that. It's hard talking to a computer screen. This is my second webinar with the NHC, and I love doing them, but it's a really different experience from teaching human beings I can actually see. But again, we'll see how far we can get. The core material I want to get across are the intellectual underpinnings of genocide. And then the case studies, if we only make it through some of the case studies, that's all right. So that said, forward into history. All right, my cunning plan for our discussion over the next hour and a half or so. I'm going to start out with some background, and that is the origin of the concept of genocide itself. And also what we might think of as genocide in world history. The Holocaust is not the first genocide, even if it's the first time we use the term genocide. And so we'll take a look at some of the things that scholars have argued would also count as genocides in world history. Then we'll ask the question, why is the 20th century so much worse than other centuries in human history when it comes to genocide? And I'll then make the argument that it's mostly because of the ideas of race and nation and how they come to dominate people's thinking about proper political organization in the modern world. And so then we'll go deeper into examining the idea of race. By the way, as a historian, I'm a political and intellectual historian, which doesn't mean I'm really smart. What it means is that I really like ideas and how ideas influence human politics and human action. And so the ideas we'll really be examining here tonight are race and nation. So once we get through the ideas of race and nation, then we'll start moving on with the case studies. And the case studies I've selected for us, and you'll see there could have been others. There are many, many genocides to choose from. But I selected these because they present a variety of different forms of genocide, a number of different expressions of the idea of genocide, and by a variety of different actors. So the first one we'll look at is the German genocide in southwestern Africa, what is modern-day Namibia, in the early 20th century. We will then move on to look at the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire and early Turkey during World War I and shortly after World War I. Then we'll take a big step forward in the 20th century to the Cambodian genocide, what's often referred to as the killing fields and sometimes referred to also as an auto-genocide. And then we'll get to maybe in Burundi and Rwanda, particularly in the 1990s, but you'll notice it's looking at 1958 to 1993. I'm providing a little bit more background on that. And then we'll conclude with some themes of genocide that hopefully you'll be able to apply in your classes.
Jonathan, we have a question here. Wasn't ancient warfare often genocidal?
Yes, indeed it is, and I'll offer up some ancient genocides for you here in just a couple of slides. Can we hold on for that? Hey, Patrick, we'll get to you there soon.
Okay.
Right, excellent. So here we go. The concept of genocide, the very idea of genocide, isn't created until 1944. And we give credit to the creation of the notion of genocide to Raphael Lemkin. Now, Raphael Lemkin was in the right place to be the person who developed the concept of genocide. Mr. Lemkin was a lawyer, he was Jewish, and he lived in Poland in the late 1930s and early 1940s. So he was there during the German and Soviet conquest of Poland in 1939, and he saw the sort of dawn of what we think of as the Holocaust there. He fortunately escaped to the United States in 1941, and in 1944 wrote a book called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Now, what's really interesting here about Raphael Lemkin as well is that even before experiencing the beginning of the Holocaust himself, he had already been writing on what he called crimes of barbarity. So that's something, the crimes of barbarity is a term he had used before he coined the term genocide. But he was one of the very few people who had looked at the Armenian genocide and the Assyrian genocide, which is it's all wrapped up actually with the Armenian genocide, although scholars sometimes treat them separately. He had already been studying this notion of the annihilation of a population, but it's in 44 that he terms the word genocide. And here's the quote that he used to introduce the term as we now understand it in part. This is from 1944. By genocide, we mean the destruction of an ethnic group. Genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan by different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of life of national groups, and the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. Now, if you think about that, what's he really describing? He's throwing all these terms at us: national groups, national feelings, religion, culture, language. What's he really talking about there? You see, it's really weird.
Okay, we have a question. What is he talking about? Sorry, I couldn't jump back in. I had a little trouble unmuting my microphone. Okay, sounds like Native American was a victim of genocide. That may want to touch
one of the
on
questions we'll look at least briefly here.
Yeah. It sounds as if he's talking about simply the absolute obliteration of the effacing of an entire culture. I mean, wiping them out altogether, almost with wiping out their memory as well.
Exactly, and that's one of the keys here, is that the genocide's not just an act of violence, it's a political act. It's also a historical act, in that you're also, in many ways, assimilation movements. There we go. Thank you, Amelia. Very good. And this is kind of what I was getting at. What we're really talking about in genocide is that genocide is the destruction of an identity. It's not always the destruction of the people themselves, but the goal of a genocide is to remove a certain identity group from some sort of political setting. So good, yeah, there you go. Just destruction of an identity. Thank you, Richard. Okay, so here, let's move on. I'll come back to those points of identity a little bit more. Lemkin's work was further reinforced by the concept of crimes against humanity. Those come from the Nuremberg trials. There was a 1946 UN resolution identifying genocide as a crime under international law, and that's really important to the political use of the term genocide nowadays, because once something is identified as a genocide, it demands international response under international law and UN resolutions. But the 1946 UN resolution states that genocide is a denial of the right of existence of entire human groups, as homicide is the denial of the right to live of individual human beings. And perhaps most important is the very contentious 1948 UN Genocide Convention, which states, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Does anybody see why the UN Convention is complicated and frequently contentious?
Okay. How do we account for its complexity and the contentiousness of it? Let's see. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children to another group. We have a question here about ISIS, but before that, we have a question of clarification. What is mental harm?
That's a great question.
Find
It
that.
doesn't exactly say there, does it?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. And there are things in here that are done legally. I mean, like forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. I mean, that, child welfare workers move kids from abusive situations, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Well, no. Deliberately inflicting, no. Causing bodily or mental harm to members of the group, killing members of the group. Yeah, let's see what our participants say.
Well, I think Patrick's getting at one of the keys is that elements of this are incredibly vague.
Yeah, precisely.
Cause mental harm to a group. I think listening to Justin Bieber causes mental harm. So, but killing members of the group, I mean, for goodness sakes, there would be no military or police action in the world that doesn't involve killing members of a group. And so the main criticism of the UN Genocide Convention is that it is at times brutally general, and it so much so that almost everything becomes a genocide. And as a result, it hardly ever gets applied as such. Wentz, which is one of the readings, Eric Wentz's A Century of Genocide, Utopias of Race and Nation, which I think, by the way, is the single best book on the issue of genocide in the 20th century. If you're going to read one, that's a great one. Wentz, in the introduction, discusses the general displeasure with the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. But let's move on from there. Yes, can torture not be educating a people by the state? That's interesting.
We have another point here. I want to bring this in. Diane raises this point about one of the problems with the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. So many of the power players in the world could be found guilty by that definition.
Absolutely. For example, and we'll get to this a little bit later on, but killing members of the group in whole or in part, strategic bombing campaigns during World War II,
right.
Which were, of course, undertaken by both the Axis and Allied powers, would all be considered genocide at that point. So the breadth of the description is so broad that it almost loses meanings at time. And Diane, here, let me type the name of the book for you. A Century of Genocide.
Do we have that listed in the last slide for resources, Jonathan? I think we may.
All right, let's move on. Genocide in world history. So here we go. Here are some of the ancient examples of genocide. And by the way, it's kind of like a hobby of historians of violence and the state to argue over what ancient conflicts should be considered as genocide or not. So here are some that have been thrown out as examples of genocide in the pre-modern world. There are extensive literatures on all of these arguing whether or not they are genocides. Pretty much the entire book of Joshua, more specifically the case of Joshua and the Amorites in the second millennium BCE, with Joshua and the Israelites destroying the Amorites in toto, is one case that's often given. Spartan conquests. No high school or college sports team should ever be named after the Spartans. The Spartans were not nice people. Sorry to offend anybody who was a Spartan. But Spartan conquests in ancient Greece, and all the people they killed and enslaved in the 7th and 8th centuries BCE. The Roman destruction of Carthage. Here's one that just about everybody agrees is a genocide, with almost all Carthaginian men being put to death, and almost all Spartan women and children following the fall of. I keep saying Spartan. All Carthaginian women and children being enslaved at the end of the Third Punic War. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, particularly in the regions where the Mongols came into contact with the Dar al-Islam, that is, in the Islamic regions of the Middle East and Inner Asia. The Mongols famously killed people who fought back hard against them, and in the Islamic regions, people put up a particularly stiff fight against the Mongols, bringing very harsh retribution, killing hundreds of thousands on repeated occasions when different cities fell. European Wars of Reformation. This is an interesting one. We often talk about the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, and such, without thinking of those as genocides. But during the Reformation in the 17th century in Europe, Europe lost 20 to 30% of its population in many regions, as entire cities were put to the sword or hung or tortured and killed in various really, really ugly ways. One of the classes that turned me into a historian was called the calamitous 17th century. And I remember being shocked by just how bad it was. But somebody brought up the issue of Native Americans. So here's a big one for you: European conquest and settlement of the Americas from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Many people would consider one very long and drawn out genocide. And if you think also about the example that was given before, the forced removal of children from their parents to be raised by other populations, one element of North American policy towards Native Americans was the removal of children from their parents, and they're being raised in boarding schools in order to remove their culture and their identity as Native Americans. But spreading the blame around, we have the Japanese invasion of Korea in the 16th century, as well as the Japanese invasion of Korea in the early 20th century. The English conquest of Ireland, also in the 16th century, as well as the use of weapon during the potato famine. The Atlantic slave trade. This is a pretty contentious one, often referred to by Afrocentric scholars as the Ma'afa, which is a term which is used like the Holocaust itself. Certainly an example of the removal of children from their parents to be raised by someone else. And finally, British settlement of Australia in the 19th century has many similar themes. Now, this is just a few that I selected, and the really depressing thing here is there are so many others I could have included. The Taiping Rebellion in the 18th century and 19th century in China, for example, is often given as an example of perhaps one of the worst genocides in human history, sometimes estimated at a total number of deaths of over 60 million. The Dutch East India Company in Indonesia, the suppression of the Oromo by the Amhara in Ethiopia. I could go on, but we would all be really depressed, and we wouldn't get through the rest of this.
Jonathan, we have a question here. You mentioned the book of Joshua. Do scholars consider other biblical instances of child deaths in particular, Egyptians and the massacre of Jewish children in Exodus, for example?
Yeah, well, so those are, yes, from the book of Joshua, it's often the description of everyone in the towns that are being slaughtered by the Israelites is given an example of genocide, but you could also include exactly, yes, the execution of Jewish children in Exodus as another example of genocide. So there's a lot of genocide to go around in that case.
John, let me ask a question. How much does the issue of deliberation and purpose enter into this? I think everyone can see the Holocaust is a quintessential genocide. The Nazis' purpose, they stated their purpose was to wipe out the Jews. The destructions of Carthage, the Roman purpose was to just wipe the Carthaginians off the map. But the European Wars of Reformation, for example, they would say, no, 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 we're not out to wipe them out. We're out to kill our enemies. We're out to reform people. Um, Same thing about the Atlantic slave trade. We're not out to wipe out Africans. We are instead, buying slaves for our plantations. So how much does the issue of deliberation and deliberate calculated purpose enter into a genocide?
That's right. It's a core issue, and it's also, by the way, interestingly enough, they might think of as genocide deniers would use exactly those same arguments. Indeed, it's what the European genocide deniers use. They say there was never really an attempt to destroy all of the Jews. We were in the middle of World War II, and certainly some populations that were not trusted, which is the same thing, by the way, which is going to be argued in the Ottoman Empire regarding the Armenians, is that some populations were sort of fifth columns inside, and the only way to guarantee the success of the war was to intern them, and then some starved to death. There was a war going on, stuff like that. But this is one of the things that's always argued. What's the difference? And again, this comes back to the vagueness of the UN resolution on genocide. What's the vagueness between fighting a war and trying to exterminate people? If the United States had been forced to invade Japan in World War II, would that have been a war of genocide if the Japanese had insisted on fighting to the death? I mean, there's no answer, of course, to these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a very fine line between a war of conquest. Cheryl says, in a war you fight against armed men, not civilians, except civilians are always there, and often and sometimes the line between civilians and armed men, armed combatants, is a fine one. But let's move on here. But those are great questions. And again, this is getting at one of the key themes here, which is the moral complexity of genocide. As we'll see, sometimes it's easy to say, we know who the bad guys here are, but at other times the violence is widespread enough amongst various groups that it's hard to define the difference between a war and a genocide. Not always, but we'll see. All right, so here's our fundamental question. Why was the 20th century so remarkably bad? Now, the 20th century, it's interesting. I was raised, I'm a child of the 60s. I grew up taking American history and Western Civ classes, and the 20th century was almost always presented positively in the history classes I had in high school and even largely in college. But when you think about it, the 20th century was really, while lots of good things happened, like the eradication of smallpox, the 20th century was also one of the most brutal and violent centuries in all of human history. And obviously World War I and World War II come to mind with that. But here's a list of really nasty conflicts, sometimes tied up with wars, sometimes not, that involved, these aren't all identified as genocides, but they all involve that targeting of civilians specifically. The Congo Free State, what's often known as the Red Rubber Scandal in Central Africa from the 1880s to 1907, brings us into the 20th century. The very conservative estimates of the number of people killed in that case is around 1 million. Some estimates go as high as 8 to 10 million. The Herero and Nama genocide in southwestern Africa, which we will talk about here in a little while. The Armenian genocide, which I've already mentioned a couple of times and we'll come back to as well, 1915 to 1923. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria and China from 1931 to 1945, with incidents such as the rape of Nanking, that being the killing of somewhere on the order of 250,000 people after the fall of the city of Nanking. in China in I think that's 1941. The manufactured famine, the Holodomor in the Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. Of course, the Holocaust, the mass execution of Jews, Roma, and others in Axis-controlled Europe from 1939 to 1945. Again, this is one that people love to debate, but strategic bombing campaigns targeting civilians. You'll notice that the first one of those is in 1932, going back to the Japanese. It was the Japanese who first utilized sort of strategic bombing against civilian targets in 1932 in China. Something which then the Germans during the Blitz and the RAF and the United States Air Force then took to another level during the period from 1942 to 1945, of course, ending with the use of nuclear weapons in Japan. Famine in Mao's China, this is both during the Great Leap Forward and later actually in the Cultural Revolution, which kills, this is a very hotly debated set of numbers, but somewhere between 500,000 and 4 million people. Indonesian anti-communism campaigns from 1965 to 1966. People often, in the United States, by the way, people often think of genocide as that stuff that those other bad guys do. You know, when we think about the Holocaust, we know the bad guys are the Nazis, and we help fight the Nazis, and we're the good guys. But the Indonesian anti-communism campaigns, which killed about 500,000 people from 1965 to 1966, were undertaken with U.S. knowledge and tacit U.S. support during the Cold War. There's the Pakistani Civil War, which results in the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. The Pakistani actions in Bangladesh are often identified as a genocide. The dirty wars in Argentina and Guatemala from the 1970s to the 1980s. These were the targetings of leftist politicians, labor leaders, and academics. This was also actually part of a larger movement known as Operation Condor in Latin America that targeted leftists, labor union leaders, and academics all across much of South Latin America, which was also undertaken with U.S. support and acquiescence. The Cambodian killing fields, which we'll try and get to under the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot from 1975 to 1979, getting to the complexity of genocides. The reason I include the Cambodian case is because it is so complex and it really doesn't fit any of the sort of frameworks that we try and use to identify and analyze genocide. It's a complicated one. And then finally, ethnic conflict and genocide in Burundi and Rwanda, 1958 to 1994, and then some others, of course, Bosnia following the collapse of Yugoslavia, the Anfal campaign in Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as attacks on Kurds and Shia in Iraq following the first Gulf War. Then the conflict in Darfur from 2003 to 2009, and somebody, I saw a comment coming by earlier on this regarding ISIS or ISIL. Most recently, their attacks on the Yazidi in Iraq, who are a religious minority, and also, by the way, their attacks on Assyrians, that is, Iraqi Christians as well. So, the 20th century and, unfortunately, the 21st century, as we see, it's pretty nasty. I see good people are debating. See, that's what historians do. We debate what's just a mass killing and what's a genocide. So you just keep that up.
Well, Jonathan, the debate has focused on strategic bombing, and of course that would include Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. And this raises a question, it seems, if the strategic bombing or the attacks could stop by one party surrendering, and then right, it would stop. How does that affect the definition of genocide? I mean, the Jews in the Holocaust, they weren't opposing exactly. Hitler. They couldn't stop. They could say, okay, we surrender, stop killing us. He would have kept doing it anyway. So how does that figure into the calculation?
Well, it's very much a part of it, and it's one reason again why there's so much criticism of that 1948 UN resolution, because it says the killing of a nation in whole or in part.
Uh-huh.
And when you firebomb Tokyo and kill 100,000 people, you have killed a significant part of Japan. Um, but again, most people would say, but that was just an attempt to bring the war to a close, and then we're going to stop killing Japanese, which I think the United States can show that they did at that point. But the reason why I brought those up is that the vagueness of that UN resolution leads to debates
Hmm.
like this.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then we also, Linda has introduced the concept of ethnicity and the way that
Yes.
figures into it. So I know we're going to get to that. So, Linda, you've raised a good point. We're going to get there. And so let's move ahead. We've got a little less than an hour. We're in good
That's
shape.
right. I think we're doing great. I haven't been shocked yet.
No, not at all.
Uh, Not one zap. Okay, now we're moving on to the intellectual side of this and these issues of race and nation and how they play into genocide in the 20th century. Uh, and I want to start out with the complexity of this and point out that one, concepts of race and nation are both modern ideas. The way we use, and one of the things I love about history is we have so many words we use without really thinking about what they mean. Race and nation are two of them. Two of my other favorites are people use culture all the time without really knowing what it means, and people also use the word civilization all the time without really having any idea what it means. Um, Race and nation are not ideas that would have been used, or the way we use them now are fundamentally different from the way they might have been used a few hundred years ago. And they both develop pretty much at the same time and deeply influence each other. Um, Both of them come out of an incredibly complicated period in modern world history. That's really the sort of period post 1500. And I've got a list of the sort of world-changing things that were happening around this time. One's the scientific revolution, which brings a fundamental transformation in how human beings understand themselves and also the universe around us. The Reformation, which in Europe at least transforms sort of spiritual and political relationships. Um, the closing of the gaps of Pangea, which is a fabulous world history concept. And that's the idea that with what's often called the voyages of discovery, I'm uncomfortable with that notion as a world historian. You only get to discover places that don't have any people in them. So it's not really discovery if there are already people that when you get there, like Columbus didn't discover the Americans. Americans discovered the Americas 14,000 years ago. Um, but closing the gaps of Pangea means the connecting of all parts of the world. Another way this is described is the creation of a single world ocean when human beings developed the ability to sail between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific and such. The gaps of Pangea are closed, and this brings people into contact with human beings they had not previously been in contact with, and that helps force the development of notions of race. But other ideas, the Enlightenment, which again fundamentally transforms the way human beings look at themselves, and the transatlantic slave trade, which really in many ways creates the Atlantic world um, that we live in today. Um, and what happens as a result of all these sort of earth shattering transformations in perspective and understanding is that Europeans in particular, but not only Europeans, are struggling to come up with a way to understand a world that is fundamentally different from the world they thought they lived in. If you think about it, discovering whole continents that Europeans didn't know existed, and of course, a similar uh, uh, sort of intellectual shock comes to Native Americans as well, and discovering that they're people coming from other continents. But the world is far more diverse than they expected or understood. And they're also grappling with rapidly changing social, economic, and political frameworks. That's why I bring in the Wars of Reformation and the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, all these things. And race and nation are two notions that develop in order for people to try and understand this world. And they're really successful ideas, so much so that nowadays we don't even question whether or not they're real, um, or that there are any alternatives to the world through this lens of race or through nation. But the idea is that I'm going to continue making that argument here. Um, so let's look at
Jonathan, if I could, if I could interrupt for a second.
Yes.
Jonathan, if I could just
Yes.
interrupt, I don't want to keep us mired in strategic bombing and wars, but a little thread showed up in the chat, and it framed a question here. Is there a useful distinction to be made between total war and genocide?
You know, if nobody surrenders in a total,
You there?
it's the result. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, for a moment it faded out, so we got you now. Yes, go ahead.
Walking in my neighborhood. I think the logical extension is that if nobody surrenders in a total war, the genocide. Because the goal of the war is to demand unconditional surrender. And if the other side refuses to surrender, if, for example, the other side stops fighting a conventional war and shifts over to a guerrilla war, if you continue to insist upon total surrender, the only option you have left would be to kill all of the other people. So again, though, I think that we can get ourselves lost in a sort of what if is this sort of situation. I don't want to shut off the discussion completely, but I do think it'll slow us down substantially. We won't get through the rest of the material. It's a great
right, I understand. So once again, we underline the moral complexity of genocide. Well, shall we move ahead?
Yes, let's go, and let's come back to this notion of race. And when we think of race, if you ask your students to define race, they'll usually start talking about physical differences between human beings. They'll say, well, race is the color of your skin, race is the texture of your hair. They might then go into certain cultural aspects as well. But what I'm going to point at here is that race is not so much the physical differences between human beings. Race is the assumption that those physical differences are tied to social and cultural differences. And this is critical. It's the idea that if someone is white or if someone is black, or if, to add some complexity to our notion of race here, if someone is Basque or if someone is Armenian, that you know things about their personality and about their character. And it's the idea that those social and cultural differences are inherited with the physical characteristics that we define as race. And this idea comes out, and again, this is why I brought up the issue of the scientific revolution. Human beings are sort of struggling with this physical diversity of human beings that they're realizing exists in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, at the same time that the scientific revolution is bringing us what we call taxonomy, which is this amazing process of defining all things that are alive in the world and showing their relationships to other things. So just as we categorize fishes into bony fishes and cartilaginous fishes or something like that, early scholars of biology and social philosophers and such were also trying to categorize race and explain it. And at the same time, it's crucial to understand this because it's Europeans who are doing this most aggressively in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. These Europeans were also seeking to come up with ways to justify what they saw as their own superiority, and in turn justifying the conquest and enslavement of non-Europeans. And so the whole process here was to come up with a sort of hierarchy of races that explained what was seen as the reality of the world at the time and the reality of this sort of European ascendancy. Now, interestingly enough, the first attempts to explain race tended to be either biblical or I think a better term for it is Abrahamic, because these explanations also come out in the Islamic world as well. Um, but for example, the case of Cain and Abel is often given as one of the explanations for why there are different races. When Cain kills Abel, he is, of course, cursed by God, and the mark of Cain is put upon him, so that all shall know him and his descendants. And one of the arguments for the existence of different races is that, well, if people don't look like us, they must be the descendants of Cain. And that's saying not only that they look different, but they're different because God has cursed them. So it comes with a stigma as well. Perhaps even more frequently cited than the mark of Cain is the curse. There is familiar with the notion of the curse of Ham in early sort of European. There you go, Noah. There you go. Good job, Patrick. Oh, Tower of Babel's another one. Good. Yeah, Cheryl. But the curse of Ham, of course, is the story of Ham seeing his father drunk, after the flood and such. And Ham, rather than averting his eyes, yes, good, Noah, drunk and naked, very good. That Ham, instead of shielding his father, mocks him and does not avert his eyes. And this being the Old Testament, the result of
Seem to have lost Jonathan for a moment. This happens sometimes. Hope Jonathan comes back. Jonathan, if you can hear me, we have lost your audio for a moment. Okay, it's supposedly still connected. Apologize for this. Sometimes the best technology breaks down, as we all know. Let's see.
hey,
there, you're back. Thank God. Okay.
I'm back. All right. At what point did I stop talking?
You were talking about the curse of Ham. See, the curse of Ham fell upon Adobe Connect.
Well, and suitable as it might be. But the curse of Ham was used both by Christians and Muslims, actually, to the enslavement of other groups who were identified as the descendants of Ham. And who are identified as the descendants of Ham depends on who's being enslaved. Slavs were long identified, for example, in Western Europe as the descendants of Ham. And it's only during the transatlantic slave trade that Hamites are redefined as Africans at that point. Other notions which we might think of as Abrahamic or biblical justifications of race is the notion of polygenesis. This is a great thing to teach to your classes, by the way, about the complexity of race and history. Anybody out there familiar with the concept of polygenesis?
Anyone familiar with polygenesis? Let's see. We may have some. Nope. Okay. I think we can go on.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Tell us.
Good. One of the things that human beings were struggling with, especially, again, Christians, were struggling with in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s was that if there was a single creation, a single Garden of Eden, and you had Adam and Eve, how could you possibly have all these people who in the world who didn't look like they were descended from the same people, especially if you realize that these at this time, the notion of the age of the earth, for Christians at least, was only about 6,000 years, what would now be known as young earthers. And so how could you possibly have all these different, quote, races, end quote, if we were all descended from a single Adam and Eve? Well, one of the arguments was degeneration, and that would be the idea that people who sin are deformed by sin, that the sin changes, makes them ugly. And so, one argument white people in Europe used for why other people in the world weren't as good looking as them was that those other people must be sinful. They had turned their backs on God, and their sinfulness had degenerated them and twisted them into the unsightly forms they were. This is often used, by the way, particularly to explain Jews. Why are Jews so ugly? And again, this is race and racism together. But it was also used for Asians and Africans and Native Americans as well. Polygenesis was an argument, and polygenesis was particularly popular in North America as a theology, was the idea that there had actually been several creations, that there had actually been several different gardens of Eden, and that God had created all of these gardens of Eden separately. And this was also biblical sanction for segregation. It's the idea that if God had created different races, then God wanted to keep them apart. So that's the notion of polygenesis to explain race. Yes, very good, Richard. Polygenesis equals several creations. In the late 19th century, of course, we have a big change, and that is the rise of the notion of evolution. And for all those of you who think I might have been picking on people, religious people, and their notions of race, I will now pick on the scientific people and their notion of race. The early model of evolution, which develops in the late 1800s and through much of the 20th century, this doesn't really change until the 1980s, actually. When was the idea of polygenesis developed? It was in the 19th century. The 1820s, 1830s, on into the 1880s are sort of the heyday of polygenesis. It then fades away because there's not much biblical support for it. But it was a very popular idea in the United States in particular. But anyway, the notion of evolution that develops in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is that races are very ancient. In particular, the argument of evolution that dominates until the 1980s is what we call the multi-regional model. And this, Richard may need to bring out the shockomatic here because I can talk about this for a very long time. The multi-regional model argues that Asians, Africans, and Europeans all diverged as evolutionary branches in the human family tree roughly 1 million years ago. And thus that race is very ancient, and that 1 million years of evolution results in human beings being very different from each other. And significantly, from this perspective of evolution, certain races were more evolved than others. And here I bring you some classic pictures. The one in the sort of bottom center there is from a late 19th century, early 20th century biology text showing the differences between Europeans, Africans, and chimpanzees, with the implication being there that Europeans, who all look like Apollo Belvedere, of course, Europeans look like Greek gods in this imagination of race, and that stressing that Africans look a lot like chimpanzees, and thus with the obvious truth being that Europeans are much more evolved than Africans, or anyone else for that matter. Now, that one's pretty brutal and what we would think of as blatantly racist, but a lot of these ideas continue even to today in much more subtle form. That's why I have the image of human evolution. Right. What have we got? Anybody want to type it up for me? What's the obvious point of that representation of human evolution?
Anyone want to take a crack at that? Okay. I have several people typing in.
There you go.
Yeah, evolution into a very handsome buff white dude for that matter. Let me just ask a question, Jonathan. Would it be fair to say one of our participants noted earlier that the whole business of defining race through the 19th century was sort of a grand, sort of stereotyping on a grand scale. Is that a fair characterization?
I would think so. It's it's the idea that races exist on the extreme,
Mm-hmm.
and that the extreme version of every race is the purest version of that race. I don't think we've got time to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the big transformations in world history and evolutionary biology in just the past 10 or 20 years has been the argument that it's really the pure races that used to be defined who are the outliers in human history.
Oh.
Diane, yes, haha, no woman in that chart either. Very good, Diane. There is actually another version. I got this, by the way, from stockphoto.com. It cost me $1. There is actually a version that has women in it. And interestingly enough, each representative woman is just behind the representative man. So it gets even more symbolic. And the second woman in line has a big afro.
Ah.
Making for an even less subtle comparison of race and evolution.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have there is the argument that different races are very different. Some are more evolved. And if anybody here, again, I could talk about this for hours and you don't want me to. What we have is the notion of scientific racism, sometimes called pseudo-scientific racism, in the late 1900s and throughout much of the 20th century. And the effort to prove that some people are smarter than other people. Craniometrics, of course, means the measuring of skulls. There are a number of different, oh yes, very good. Many universities here had departments of eugenics. Eugenics was very much part of this. You'll see that it's in the next set under political expressions. But the idea was that there would be ways to prove that certain people were smarter than other people. And those could come from measuring the skull, measuring the morphology of the skull. Were narrow skulls associated with smarter people, or were rounder skulls associated with smarter people? Were heavier brains associated with smarter people? And of course, in the 20th century, the rise of the IQ test. And here I'll throw out, if anybody's interested in all this stuff, read Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man. It's not perfect, but it's a very interesting source on the various ways human beings, the argument of human intelligence and evolution has been made. So anyway, what are the political expressions of this? And this is really important. And man, we got to get a move on now. I think I just got shocked. Social Darwinism, which is often attributed to the British philosopher Herbert Spencer. Social Darwinism is the argument that human societies are in competition just like human species, and that the expression of superiority for a human society is its ability to defeat and exterminate other human societies, or to force other societies to accept their culture. So there are genetic social Darwinists, those are the ones who kill everybody else, and there are cultural social Darwinists, those who force other people to accept their language, religion, and culture. We'll come back to social Darwinism in some of our case studies. Eugenics, of course, is the notion that you can improve the human species by weeding out the inferior humans, be they certain ethnic groups, be they certain races, be they certain social groups, or be they just the dumb people. And if anybody here has been following the cases in North Carolina, up until 1974, North Carolina was forcibly sterilizing people on the basis of intelligence. And so a number of those people are still alive and have recently been suing the North Carolinian government. And it was, by the way, eugenics boards that did that. But anyway, utopian aspirations, and here's where we make the shift to our next big idea, is the idea that if you can get rid of all the people you don't want, you can make a perfect nation, a place where there will be wonder and harmony and great progress. And that's where we'll move on here to the notion of the nation. Another thing historians love to debate is when the concept of the nation arises. There's some really interesting scholarship on that. It's usually attributed to the French following the French Revolution, although there are various other cases put forward. But the big point here is that the nation is different from a state or from a country or from an empire, in that the nation, the concept behind the nation is that it is the vehicle by which a race, through political, social, and economic unity could achieve its greatness. And here's the big point. In order to be successful, a nation needed to be racially, culturally, and religiously homogeneous. So the more diverse, and this is a great thing to discuss with students now, because now we talk about diversity and multiculturalism, although those are certainly contested and politically loaded terms. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, the whole idea was that the less diverse you were, again, culturally, racially, or religiously, the stronger a nation you were going to be. And I'm not talking about Nazi Germany here. Obviously enough, I bring cases here from the United States to show that these were ideas which permeated much of what we think of as the Western world, and increasingly the whole world over the course of the 20th century. Here's John Jay from the Federalist Papers, where he says, Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. Now, obviously, we know who John Jay's talking about there. He's talking about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. He's not talking about enslaved Africans. He's not talking about Native Americans. He's not even talking about Italian immigrants, which of course there are not many of in the late 1700s. But when you think about the notion of the nation in these terms, the exclusion of non-whites or non-Protestants or non-Anglos from sovereignty in early U.S. history makes perfect sense. And I see Amelia sees this too. My favorite example for this in classes, I'm not big on showing films in classes. I think they take too long in general. But I often, in my 20th century world history classes and when I teach African American history, I show Birth of a Nation. And can I get a show of hands out there? How many people have seen Birth of a Nation or have used it in class?
Anyone? We got some folks. Yes, both. Diane has raised her hand. We have
Excellent. You are all very smart people.
Yeah.
Even if you haven't used it in class. You see, and the difference between teachers and students, not a single one of my students has ever seen Birth of a Nation or even heard of it often before I bring it up in class. But Birth of a Nation is a perfect example of the elision of race and nation, because if you remember the basic argument of Birth of a Nation, it's that the United States is not a nation until after the Civil War. And it only becomes a nation because, as the argument in the movie is made, it's only when white Northerners and white Southerners come to agree that the common enemy is black people that the United States becomes a true nation. And this goes back to that utopian notion, too. Richard and I were discussing before that one of the interesting things about Birth of a Nation is it actually isn't just one film. The movie was re-released nonstop for close to 20 years. There were always different versions of it being shown from 1916 to like 1932 or 1933. But it often had different endings. And one of the interesting endings, the one I use in my classes, is that at the end of the movie it says, it's not a talkie yet, but the text says, and now it is up to you, which world will you choose to live in? And then it shows a scene that's full of white people waving his hand in approval. And then and punching and kicking each other with a Satan figure sitting on a bull swinging a sword back and forth. So the choice it makes is, you can choose between a white utopia or a black hell. And so that's the argument for race and nation in the United States. And wow, really quickly, let me show you how these ideas have developed geographically. This is to reinforce this idea that the world and the image of the world changes radically. This is the Hereford Mappamundi from around 1300 on the left, which shows a single unified world. So this is how many people, and this is similar to maps found in North Africa and Europe and many parts of Asia around this time. And the image on the right, the Frederick de Witt, is, I'm an Africanist, so I used an image of Africa, but this shows the growing sort of notion that the world's divided up into different places that are separate and with different people in them. Then the Reynolds map from 1771 here, this one's really significant. It's kind of hard to see here, but if you see in the bulge of West Africa where it says Lower Ethiopia, if you look right above that, you might be able to make out that it says Negro land on it. So it's the notion of race is beginning to assert itself. And if you think 1771, that's really just as the transatlantic slave trade is reaching its peak. And so the notion of race there is really asserting itself. Again, in 1856, we see a map that divides the world up into races. And again, such things did not exist 200 years before or 300 years before. Nobody would ever think of making a map and listing all the races. You might have different ethnicities or different states, but you wouldn't have races as a unifying concept for the maps. Then to hopefully get us to transition to at least one case study of genocide here, this is a colonial map of the world showing that sort of level of European domination, which is often justified in terms of race. I saw some people referencing the white man's burden before. And so this is a sort of colonial map of the world around 1900 on the left. And then finally, the dominance of the notion of the nation there in the modern world map, although Brownie points to anybody who can spot a country that's missing on that map. But, okay, so now on to case studies. Now, the goal here is to provide a chronological examination of the ways race and nation play out in the genocides of the 20th century. And again, the 4 case studies are Southwestern Africa with the Herero and Nama, the Armenian genocide, Cambodian genocide, and Burundi and Rwanda. I'm guessing at 8:07 here, we're going to get through the first 2, maybe not the last 2, but we'll see. And is everybody faith in humanity yet?
I don't think so. Well, kind of. Some people have, but the weekend is coming, and so we can all restore ourselves at that time. So why don't we move ahead to the Herero and Nama genocides, 1904, 1906.
Remember all the love. Cheryl's
question about losing faith.
That's beautiful.
Yeah,
okay, so here we go. The Herero and Nama genocides. I really like this image here, and it's a great way of complicating. Also, by the way, again, I'm an African historian. It complicates our understanding of Africa. See this picture here. What's your impression?
Okay, what's our impression here when you look at those folks? What Africans? What do we think? Well, they're they're well dressed, certainly.
Multiple attendees are typing, bless your hearts.
Yeah.
Those are some dapper dudes. All of the men appear wealthy. That's good. Yeah. And these are some wealthy dudes. Africans dressed like Europeans. Very interesting.
Right.
Very interesting.
Right. But then you've got that fellow on the left who is not African. He's not dressed in civilian clothes. He's in a uniform. He's the authority figure. White, the only one is a chair. That's right. He's sitting, but he's sitting in a chair. Civilized. The other guy seems to be sitting on something of a stool, but he's clearly authority figure here.
Yeah, good. One of the keys here is that the context, by the way, is that Germany was given sovereignty over the region of Southwest Africa, what we now call Namibia, during the Conference of Berlin in 1884 and 1885. But German and British missionaries, as well as what we might now think of as South African missionaries had been active in this region of Namibia for over 100 years. So European contact, African contact with Europeans is not new. Indeed, it's been going on long enough that the Herero have, and Nama, by the way, have developed a style of clothing all their own. And by the way, this style of hat and the sort of style of dress is sort of uniquely Herero, and I wish we had time to discuss Herero women's clothing. It's a really interesting sort of Epicurean and cosmopolitan mix of African and European styles. Um, but there had been a lot of interaction, most of it relatively peaceful, and much of it sort of peaceful missionizing. A very large number of Herero and Nama had, by the late 1800s, converted to Christianity by choice at this time. Um, but as German influence in the region grew, there were increasing tensions, in no small part because Namibia is rather arid. There is not a lot of good agricultural ground. Most people are pastoralists, and it gets crowded pretty fast when you bring other people into a region where pastoralism is the main source of the economy. And indeed, in 1904, the Herero respond to a wave of German settlement, which is in part fostered by an introduction of a railroad into the area by launching attacks on European farms and settlements. Now, these are very violent attacks. You see here, roughly 150 Europeans, including many women and children, are killed in this. And again, this is getting at the complexity of genocides, in that while the Germans are using a certain sort of cultural violence and are immigrating to this region in much greater numbers than the Herero want, most people also agree that the massacre of women and children, and men too, is not very nice. But the Herero and Nama believe that they have such a substantial dominance of force over the Germans. And by the way, the Herero and Nama are also armed at this time. Most of them have firearms. That they will be able to drive the Germans out of the territory and stop this wave of immigration. And they're initially successful in this, and they force the Germans back into two urban centers, Okolanja and Windhoek. And this is an example of also how technology changes the 20th century. Because of steam transport and the introduction of railroads, the Germans are very quickly able to bring a significant number of very heavily armed troops into southwestern Africa that same year, within just 2 or 3 months, actually. And these troops then attack the Herero and Nama forces, and in August of 1904, at the Battle of Waterberg, crushingly defeat the Herero and Nama troops. What's different here, though, is what happens afterwards. And this is what's often, by the way, referred to as a tipping point. Where do you go from warfare and murder of civilians, what might be called a pogrom or something, and where does it tip over into a genocide? And it's following the Battle of Waterberg that what happens in southwestern Africa, most people agree, becomes a genocide. And that is that the Germans set out to kill all of the Herero and Nama. Indeed, von Trotha, the German general, had stated even before reaching Namibia, before reaching southwestern Africa, that his goal was to exterminate the Herero. So he stated, I believe, that the nation, it's interesting use of nation there too, by the way, as such should be annihilated, or if this was not possible by tactical measures, have to be expelled from the country. This will be possible if the water holes from Grootfontein to Gababis are occupied. The constant movement of our troops will enable us to find small groups of nation who have moved backwards and destroy them gradually. And von Trotha later expounds upon this and states in what's known as the infamous extermination order, I, the great German general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Hereros. The Hereros are German subjects no longer. They have killed, stolen, cut off the ears and other body parts of wounded soldiers, and are now too cowardly to want to fight any longer. The Herero nation must leave the country. If it refuses, it shall be compelled to do so with the long tube, which is the cannon, which is another example of technology here. Any Herero found inside the German frontier with or without a gun or cattle will be executed. I shall spare neither women nor children. I shall give the order to drive them away and fire on them. Such are my words to the Herero people. The result of this is that roughly 80% of the Herero and Nama are killed, not only in the initial conflict, but the Germans then drive them into the desert. And they also, at this point, begin poisoning the water holes. And by the end of 1904, the ability of the Herero and Nama to fight has ended. Most surrender. They are rounded up and put into concentration camps and work camps where tens of thousands die from starvation, disease, and exposure. And as a really frightening sort of preface to what's going to happen later in the Holocaust, thousands of the Herero and Nama in these camps are subjected to dissection, military experiments, with much of the goal being to sort of show the difference between the Herero race or the African race and the German race, improve German superiority. And again, it's believed that probably 80% of the Herero and Nama are killed during this time. That's about 80,000 people. And following this, the Germans launch a wave of settlement into the region, which has been largely depopulated and which also turns out to be one of the world's great stores of diamonds. To show that genocide is historical and political as well, while there wasn't much attention to the Herero and Nama genocide at the time, it has become a major issue in terms of relations between Germany and Namibia in recent years, and has recently, very recently, just in the past 5 years, resulted in an official German apology and payment of reparations, and interestingly enough, the repatriation of human remains to Namibia. The skull there at the very bottom center is from a German, I believe that's from the Goethe Institute, actually. That was a scientific specimen. So if you were a German physical anthropology student or something, the human remains you would study in learning about human osteology would very likely be the victims of genocide in the early 20th century. Some of these are pretty brutal. The one on the left is an embalmed human head that was used as an example of the sort of physical morphology of the Herero and such. So that's the Herero and Nama genocide. It's a great example of the sort of elision of colonialism and imperialism and genocide. And let's get on to the Armenian genocide here, because this is a really crucial one for understanding race and nation. Yes, Cheryl, Germany did have to Israel, actually, following the Holocaust. But the Armenian genocide, again, is a perfect example, I think, in many ways, of the elision of race and culture and nation. A little bit of background here. The Armenian genocide takes place in World War I, which is, of course, itself largely a war of nationalism. And we have to put this in the context that this is the transformation. It takes the Armenian genocide as part and parcel of the transition of the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish nation. And this is, again, a way of getting at the difference between empire and nation. Empires are by nature multicultural because one group has sort of imposed itself on a number of others and created a sort of hierarchy of relations. But the Ottomans, as you probably know, were often referred to as the sick man of Europe in the late 1800s and early 19th century, early 20th century. And many Ottoman modernizers, particularly the group we know as the Young Turks, were seeking to transform the Ottoman Empire into a nation, with the idea that the reason the Ottoman Empire was weak compared to European states was it wasn't national enough. And so among the things they wanted to do was change to a constitutional monarchy, to industrialize, but they also sought to build a nation that had a shared Turkish identity. And again, when you think of what is a national identity, you think of a nation with a single culture that is a single language where everyone would speak Turkish, not also speak Armenian and Assyrian and Arabic and Greek, but would only speak Turkish, wouldn't speak Kurdish for that matter, that would share a single national style of dress, would eat a certain national style of food, and would share a single religion. Um, and so what happens then in the course of World War I is that the Armenians who speak a different language, they speak Armenian instead of Turkish, uh, and Armenians are also Russian Orthodox, members of the Russian Orthodox Church. Um, that while the Armenians had been recognized as a what's called a millet, that is a semi-autonomous region within the Ottoman Empire, when World War I broke out, the fears were that the Armenians would side with the Russians, and indeed this was particularly a problem because early in World War I, at least, the Russians made significant territorial advances against the Ottoman Empire. The Russians were successful early in the war. And the fear of the Young Turks, of the Turkish nationalists, was that Armenian nationalism would lead to the Armenians becoming traitors to the Ottoman Empire. And the result of this is the Armenian Genocide. And what happens is that the Turkish troops, the Ottoman troops, well, first, all Armenian military members, all troops and officers in the Ottoman army who are of Armenian origin are removed, forcibly removed from the military, and then Armenian leaders, merchants, and educated members are removed and killed. Then Armenian populations were forcibly removed, often by forced marches. Many were forced to march all the way to Syria, which, by the way, is a long way. And hundreds of thousands died of exposure, dehydration on the way. Rape was frequently used as a weapon against Armenian women, and many Armenian women and children were forced to assimilate. That is, they were forced to assimilate, speak only Turkish, that they were absorbed into Turkish families. And groups that took part in this genocide were rewarded with the land and property taken from the Armenians. And don't have time to go into it, but one of the ironies of this conflict was that the Kurds, who are not Turkish but who are Muslim, were very active in this genocide. The Kurdish cavalries were allowed to attack the groups of Armenian refugees and kill them and take their stuff. The Kurds, of course, later on become victims of Turkish nationalism themselves because by the mid-20th century, they are deemed not Turkish enough. Anyway, the estimated death toll of the Armenian genocide is roughly 1.5 million. And what's really gets complicated here is that the result of the Armenian genocide, and also the genocide of the Assyrians and Anatolian Greeks at this same time, is the successful creation of the Turkish nation. And that Turkey, under Ataturk in particular, is often given as an example of a successful transition from a backwards, religiously oriented empire to a successful, secular, modern nation. I don't know if anybody remembers back following 9/11 and such, but Musharraf in Pakistan, many people justified the United States' support of Musharraf in Pakistan as a military dictator on the grounds that he was going to be the Pakistani Ataturk, that he was going to do for Pakistan what Ataturk had done for Turkey, which in the mind of many American pundits in following 9/11 was a good thing if you were going to force it to become a more modern nation and more secular. And one of course, the unfortunate things was that there was very little contemporary outcry in the context of World War I and very limited historical condemnation of the Armenian genocide. Today, by the way, there is an ongoing Turkish denial of the genocide. So this is going back to what we were discussing before, the position of the Turkish government, and I might add, without naming any names, of many scholars in Europe and the United States who are supported by the Turkish government, is that what happened in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, was just part of World War One, and that certain groups rebel, and that rebellion was put down by the only means available to the Ottoman state, and that it wasn't a genocide, it was just a war, and there were internal revolts.
Mhm. Jonathan, I think you just answered one of the questions in the forum. Why isn't this genocide better known?
Speaking of the Armenian
Not the
genocide
forum,
in
chat.
particular.
Yeah. In the chat, one of our participants
Oh,
asked why
okay.
wasn't it better known, and I think you just answered it. With people considered it, or well, the apologists for it considered it part of World War One, and then it got caught up in the whole ideology of modernization, which was considered a good here in the West. And then we also have a comment. There's a lot of lobbying in Congress about a declaration of genocide, if I remember correctly.
Yes,
Um,
this has been a really serious sticking point. It was
yeah.
one of the main reasons why the Turkish government was very hesitant in its support for the Second Gulf War,
Uh-huh.
because they were afraid of what has indeed happened, is that an autonomous Kurdish state has been established in northern
Yeah.
Iraq, and it's the PKK, the Kurdish People's Party, in Turkey has been a identified as a terrorist group in Turkey for the past 30 years. And up until just a few years ago, it was against the law to speak Kurdish in
Uh-huh.
Turkey. So Turkey still has a difficult sort of notion of multiculturalism. But yes, there was a big push a year or two ago to get censure in Congress against Turkey for the Armenian genocide, and that failed. And I have to throw out, in one of the bizarre sort of twists of modern pop culture, is that one of the people who has done the most to sort of popularize the notion of the Armenian genocide is Kim Kardashian, of all people. And the Kardashians, yes, very good, JG, excellent quote. Yes, Hitler's argument for the Holocaust, because nobody remembered the Armenians. But the Kardashians have used their somewhat questionable fame, at least to bring attention to the Armenian genocide, in that the Kardashians themselves were refugees from the Ottoman Empire. They left their family left in the 1880s,
Mhm.
and sort of saw the writing on the wall at that point. All
Mhm.
right,
We have
Richard,
one
let's
question.
do what? Go ahead.
We have one question. Is this not connected to earlier persecution of Christian minorities in the Pontic genocide?
Whoa, I'll have
Oh,
to plead ignorance of that.
yes.
Um,
That's one that's not gotten publicity, the Pontic genocide.
stump the presenter. Good job, Molly. I'll have to go look that up.
Okay.
Uh,
I'll tell you what, let's do. It's 8:27. I think our participants will stick around for a while. Why don't we go ahead and do one more, which I think was the Cambodian, and
oh,
then we.
the most complicated one. There you go.
Oh well. Okay, of
No,
course we
no,
say we
okay,
say that.
Molly's clarifying that. Okay, that's I know that is the genocide of Ionian Greeks.
Ah,
Yes, so that's the same time. Yes, absolutely, it is tied to the earlier persecution of Greek Christians, particularly in Ionia. But of course, the Greeks had already fought a war of revolution against the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s, and this is one of the reasons why the Ottomans saw Christians as a threat to the empire or the Turkish state. But yes, absolutely, Molly. Okay, let's move on, and I'll do this as quickly as possible because this is one of the most complicated of them all, and that this is an ideological genocide. And by the way, another one of the criticisms of the 1948 UN resolution on genocide is it makes no mention of targeting of ideological groups. It identifies groups as cultural groups, it identifies groups as ethnic or racial groups, but not as people who believe in a particular political idea. Um, Now, the context of the Cambodian killing fields, the Cambodian genocide, or the Cambodian politicide, as it's sometimes called, is the Cold War in Southeast Asia. So we have the conflict in Vietnam between the United States and the North Vietnamese, and with the influence of the Chinese and Soviet Union. Cambodia tries very hard through much of the 1960s to remain neutral, and this is the government under King Sihanouk, who actually just passed away last year. Um, but in 1970, there is a right wing coup, which many people to have been supported by the United States, which overthrows the Sihanouk government. And Lon Nol comes to power as a military dictator. And what Lon Nol is, he gives support to the United States to allow airstrikes in eastern Cambodia. And so this is like the bombing of Laos by the United States at this time. The United States knew that arms and supplies were being brought into North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia. The the airstrikes of this period, though, in the nature of B-52 strikes, um, killed what is estimated to be about 150,000 Cambodians, which resulted in, as you might guess, an awful lot of Cambodians growing very, very unhappy with the Lon Nol regime. And what this does is it provides an opening for a group called the Khmer Rouge, that is the Red Cambodians, who are a Chinese inspired communist movement led by Pol Pot. And who himself is an interesting guy. He did not come up as a peasant. He actually came from a very middle class Cambodian family. Um, but the Khmer Rouge are able to seize control of Cambodia and the capital Phnom Penh by 1975. They changed the country's name to Kampuchea, which so far is not terribly remarkable. What it is, though, is that the Khmer have plans, and here's again this notion of sort of utopia. By the way, just as the Turks were going to create a Turkish Cambodia by creating a Turkish, not Turkish Cambodia, a Turkish utopia by creating the Turkish nation, the Khmer Rouge planned to create an ideological agrarian utopia. And here's where this gets really complicated. The Khmer Rouge wind up targeting a huge variety of populations. They target just about everybody who they believe to have been tainted by what we might think of as modernization or westernization. So almost all of the cities in Cambodia are depopulated. People are literally forced out at the barrel of a gun. And forced onto collective farms, which are, by the way, segregated by age and gender. So you have farms which are all young men, or farms which are all older women, or farms which are all children. All the sort of trappings that we might think of modern society are banned. There's no money. Hospitals, universities, and schools are shut down. Factories are shut down. All religions are banned, which is astounding considering that Cambodia is about 90% Buddhist. And so anybody who complains, by the way, is killed. One of the really frightening things about the Cambodian genocide is that almost everybody who was killed had a file kept on them, which identified when they were deemed no longer worthy of living, and how they were killed, and when they were killed. And so yes, and pictures. There you go. And there's a really frightening sort of, it provides a lot to work with from an instructional or scholarly standpoint, but it's also really depressing. But other groups are targeted as well as those we might think of who are being targeted on a class basis. Cambodians of Chinese descent, Vietnamese descent, Thai descent, and also Cambodian Muslims, the Sham, are also targeted. Why wasn't somebody there to stop it? Isn't that a great question? An estimated 1.5 to 2 million people are killed over the course of about 4 years, most dying either from execution or from disease, exhaustion, and starvation. And this is about 20 to 25% of the Cambodian population. And in an interesting Twist there. Thank you, James. It's the Vietnamese who stop it. Now it's interesting because the Vietnamese had originally supported the Khmer Rouge, but it only takes the Vietnamese about 4 years to decide that the Khmer Rouge are stone cold crazy and invade. And it's interesting also that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were attempting to emulate, in many ways, the Great Leap Forward or Cultural Revolution of China, but they also targeted the Chinese Cambodians as well. The Cambodian genocide is so confounding that it is often referred to as an auto genocide, that it's the sort of genocidal equivalent of suicide. That it's almost inexplicable to understand why a state, why a community would do such a thing. But that's the Cambodian genocide for you. I'm sorry I don't have time to get to Rwanda and Burundi, but I encourage you all to read through. You'll see that I'm an African historian. The details here are somewhat more detailed than the other case studies, so that'll give you some good material to look through. I invite you in particular to look at the notion of ethnogenesis, that is, the creation of the idea of being Hutu and the idea of being Tutsi. Those are very, very modern identities. They didn't really exist just 100 years ago, and put those in the context of colonialism.
And Jonathan, you've given us an enormous amount to think about, even if we didn't get to the Rwandan genocide. And here it continues, ladies and gentlemen, with some useful sources. I see Ben Kiernan's name on there. Ben was a fellow at the National Humanities Center a few years ago. And we have a comment from a teacher. Teacher materials from history and ourselves are excellent, and Samantha Power's work on 20th century genocides is great. Peter Balakian's work is good for students to examine a young man asking questions about the lack of family history after 1915. He then examines the Armenian genocide. He traces history from questions he has about his family. Any comment about those resources, Jonathan?
Those sound absolutely excellent. I'm not familiar with history in ourselves on that, but that looks really good. So that's right. Great, Jay. I can tell your class rocks.
Yeah, and Never Fall Down is excellent. I can also recommend History in Ourselves. History in Ourselves, I believe it's a Boston group that does take a kind of a global view. I know they focus on the Holocaust a great deal. Oh, Facing History, yes, that's another organization like that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end. I see we're wrapping up with our final questions and comments here. Jonathan, I want to thank you very much for an excellent and enthusiastic seminar. As I said, you've given us a lot to think about, and you addressed all the concerns that the people had in the forum, and then some. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody personally. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Claudia. You're a great bunch. I really enjoyed this. As I said, this is a weird way to interact with people, but I really had a blast. As much fun as you can have talking about mass murder and genocide. And by the way, Richard, I talk about happy things too. I do like great stuff on food and world history. We should come back and try that sometime.
That would be great. We could do one, and maybe the assigned readings would be not readings, but they'd be recipes, and people could try them.
I do that. Meals we can deconstruct.
Oh, great. Okay, well, that sounds wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please continue to use the form, use the discussion, use the form to continue that, and share fresh approaches. We'll monitor the form until March 15th, so if anything comes over the transom, we'll pass it on to Jonathan and get back in touch with you. Finally, I want to thank all of you tonight for your enthusiastic and intelligent participation. As I said earlier, you folks make these webinars, and we really appreciate it when you speak up a great deal and offer your comments and questions. Please check back to americainclass.org for our webinar schedule. The next one is Teaching the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That'll be 7 p.m. February 19th. Please don't forget to submit your evaluations. As I said, we really pay attention to them and try to improve our programs based on what you tell us. Once again, I want to thank you for your participation, and good evening.
Yeah, and come back for David Christian in a few weeks. He's a friend of mine, and he's really smart.
Okay, that's our
History with
that's
David
our
Christian.
we're going to have a really big seminar with a really big history. So join us. That's coming up in March. Hope we'll see you all then, and hope we see some of you, all of you again, for Huck Finn on the 19th. Again, thanks. We see you again. Bye-bye.